There's an old saying in my family that you should never ignore the flicker of a lantern when walking alone at night. I always thought it was some outdated superstition, something my grandparents said to scare us into staying indoors after dark. But last winter, I found out the hard way that there might have been more to their warnings than I ever gave them credit for. It was just after New Year's and I was back in my hometown visiting my parents. They live in a rural area surrounded by thick woods and winding dirt roads. It's the kind of place where streetlights are a luxury and cell phone signals come and go like the wind. One night, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The air was crisp and the moonlight reflected off the snow-covered ground, giving everything an eerie glow. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd grown up exploring those woods and knew the paths like the back of my hand. About a mile into my walk, I noticed a light flickering in the distance. It was faint at first, just a small orange glow bobbing up and down like someone was carrying a lantern. I figured it was one of the neighbors out for a late night stroll, or maybe checking on their property. As I got closer, I started to feel uneasy. The light didn't seem to follow any path. It moved erratically, darting in and out of the trees like it was alive. The strangest part was that I couldn't see who or what was carrying it. I stopped in my tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light stopped too, hovering a few feet above the ground, as if it were watching me. That's when I remembered my grandparents' warning about lanterns. They used to tell us stories about a spirit that roamed the woods at night, carrying a lantern to guide lost travelers or to lure them deeper into the forest, depending on its mood. If the lantern burned steady and bright, the spirit was there to protect you. But if it flickered, it was a sign to turn back. The light in front of me was flickering like crazy. My heart started to race, and I turned to head back the way I came. That's when I heard a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded like a growl, deep and menacing. I picked up my pace, practically running through the snow. The light followed me, darting between the trees and closing the distance with every step. No matter how fast I ran, it seemed to be right behind me, its flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. I finally broke through the tree line and reached the edge of my parents' property. As soon as I stepped into the clearing, the light disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. I stumbled into the house, breathless and shaken. My parents asked what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? The next morning, I went back to the woods to see if I could find any sign of the light. I followed the same path, but everything looked normal. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone or anything had been there. Since then, I've done some research on similar phenomena, and it turns out that stories about lantern spirits are surprisingly common in rural areas. Some people believe they're guardians, protecting travelers from harm. Others think they're hunters, leading the unsuspecting to their doom. I still don't know what I encountered that night. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But part of me can't shake the feeling that something was out there watching me, testing me. Now, whenever I visit my parents, I make sure to stay inside after dark. The woods might be beautiful, but they have their secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. I can still see that flickering light in my mind, burning like a warning. Whatever it was, I'm just grateful that I didn't stick around to find out whether it was a guardian or a hunter. Growing up, I used to stay at my grandparents' old Victorian house every summer. The place was massive, with high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and rooms that always seemed too dark, no matter how many lamps you turned on. My grandmother loved that house and always said it had character, but even as a kid I felt like there was something wrong with it. The upstairs hallway was the worst. It stretched endlessly, with doors lining both sides and an old mirror hung right in the middle. That mirror was ancient, with a tarnished silver frame and glass that seemed to warp whatever it reflected. No matter where you stood, it felt like the mirror was watching you. I remember one summer when I was about 12, something happened that still haunts me to this day. My parents had gone on a trip, leaving me to stay with my grandparents for a few weeks. I didn't mind they spoiled me with cookies, let me stay up late, and never forced me to do chores. But that summer I spent more time alone than usual. My grandfather wasn't feeling well, so my grandmother was constantly by his side, and I was left to entertain myself. One night I was up late in the living room, flipping through a book. The house was dead silent, except for the occasional groan of the floorboards as they settled. At some point I realized I needed to grab something from my bag, which was upstairs in the guest room. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I felt a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to wrap itself around me. The air was colder than it should have been, and I swear I could hear faint whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. Trying to shake it off, I hurried down the hallway, keeping my eyes on the floor. The guest room was at the far end, and the quicker I got there, the better. As I passed the mirror, I felt an overwhelming urge to glance at it. I don't know why, I just did. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. There was something behind me. It wasn't a person exactly, more like a shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms that hung at its sides. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, just a smooth expanse of darkness. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, closer this time, its head tilted like it was studying me. I bolted to the guest room, slamming the door shut behind me. For the rest of the night, I stayed huddled under the blankets, too scared to even peek out. The next morning, I told my grandmother about what I'd seen. She brushed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination or the shadows playing tricks on me. But later that day, she pulled me aside and said something that sent chills down my spine. She told me that the house had a history. Decades ago, before my grandparents bought it, a young woman had lived there with her husband. According to local gossip, the husband was abusive, and one night, after a particularly violent fight, the woman vanished. Some people thought she ran away, while others believed something more sinister had happened. The strange part was that the husband claimed she had walked out of the house in the middle of the night, but neighbors swore they saw her standing in the upstairs hallway just hours before she disappeared. Hearing that story only made me more afraid of the mirror and the hallway. I avoided going upstairs alone as much as possible, and when I did, I made sure to keep my eyes fixed straight ahead. But the shadow wasn't done with me. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. At first, I thought it was rain hitting the window, but when I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway. It was slow and deliberate, like someone tapping their fingernails against the wall. I wanted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed and opened the door just a crack. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the mirror in the dim light. And then I saw it. The shadow was back, standing directly in front of the mirror. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its head tilted like it was waiting for something. I closed the door as quietly as I could and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head. The tapping continued for what felt like hours before it finally stopped. The next morning, I begged my parents to come pick me up early. I didn't tell them exactly why, I just said I wasn't feeling well and wanted to go home. They showed up that afternoon, and as soon as I walked out of that house, I felt like I could breathe again. I haven't been back to my grandparents' house since. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, and my grandfather moved into a smaller place closer to my parents. I've thought about going back, just to see if the mirror is still there, but every time I get close to the idea, I feel that same cold, suffocating presence. I don't know what the shadow was or what it wanted, but I do know this: whatever is in that house isn't just a figment of my imagination. It's real, and it's watching. There was something. When I was 20, I moved into a small rental house just outside of town. It wasn't much to look at: a tiny one-story place with peeling paint and a yard that had long since given up on grass. But it was cheap, and as a broke college student, that was all I cared about. The landlord was a quiet, older woman who didn't say much during our first meeting. She handed me the keys and warned me to keep the doors locked, especially at night. It struck me as a bit odd, but I chalked it up to her being overly cautious. At first, the house seemed perfectly normal, if not a little worn down. The floors creaked when I walked, and the pipes groaned whenever I turned on the hot water, but I figured that was just the charm of living in an old place. It wasn't until my second week there that I started noticing the strange things. It started small objects not being where I left them, lights flickering for no reason, and cold spots that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I brushed it off as me being forgetful or the house just showing its age. But then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had been up late studying for an exam, and as I finally crawled into bed, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be the wind knocking a branch against the window, but when I got up to check, the windows were shut tight, and there wasn't a tree anywhere near the house. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. Telling myself it was nothing, I went back to bed and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the coffee table in the living room, there was a single playing card of Queen of Hearts. I didn't own a deck of cards, and I had no idea where it could have come from. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. More objects appeared in strange places: an old key on my kitchen counter, a child's marble on my nightstand, and a single black feather on the bathroom sink. None of these things belonged to me, and I couldn't figure out how they were getting into the house. Then came the dreams. They started as fragmented images: a dark figure standing in the corner of my room, whispering words I couldn't understand. But soon, the dreams became more vivid. In one, I was standing in the middle of my living room, surrounded by shadows. A voice, soft but commanding, told me to leave. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was just stress from school getting to me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. A few days later, I decided to call my best friend, Sarah, and ask her to stay over. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't want her to think I was losing it, but I said I was feeling uneasy in the house and would feel better if she kept me company. That night, as we were sitting on the couch watching TV, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Sarah pulled a blanket around her and joked that my house was trying to turn us into popsicles. I laughed nervously, but my mind was racing. Then, the tapping started again. It was coming from the hallway this time, louder and more insistent than before. Sarah froze, her eyes wide, and whispered that she thought she saw something move. We both turned to look, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light, there was a shadow. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible against the darkness. For a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it moved, stepping back into the shadows until it disappeared completely. Sarah and I didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, clutching each other on the couch, jumping at every little noise. By morning, she was begging me to leave the house, saying there was something seriously wrong with it. I wanted to leave, I really did, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. So instead, I decided to do some digging. I went to the local library and started searching for any information I could find about the house. It didn't take long for me to uncover its dark history. In the 1950s, a man named Edward Harris had lived there with his wife and young daughter. According to old newspaper articles, Edward was a paranoid recluse who rarely left the house. One day, his wife and daughter vanished without a trace. Edward claimed they had gone to visit relatives, but the police suspected foul play. A few weeks later, Edward was found dead in the house, hanging from a beam in the attic. The case was ruled a murder-suicide, though the bodies of his wife and daughter were never found. Armed with this information, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in haunted locations. She agreed to come to the house and see if she could sense anything. The moment she walked through the door, her expression changed. She said the air felt heavy, like something tragic had happened there. As we walked through the house, she paused in the hallway and said she could feel a presence of spirit that was watching, waiting. She told me that not all spirits are malicious. Some are just lost, trapped in a cycle of pain and grief. But others, she warned, can be dangerous, especially if they feel threatened. I asked her what I should do, and she suggested a cleansing ritual to help the spirit move on. She gave me a list of supplies and instructions, but I was too scared to do it on my own. That night, I stayed at Sarah's place, and we talked about what to do. Sarah suggested I move out and let the landlord deal with it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving without trying to help would only make things worse. The next day, Sarah and I went back to the house together and performed the ritual. We lit candles, burned sage, and repeated the words the historian had given me. For a moment, the air seemed to grow even heavier, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. Then, just as quickly as it came, the feeling lifted. The house felt lighter, almost peaceful, like whatever had been there was finally gone. I stayed in the house for a few more months, and during that time, nothing strange happened. The tapping stopped, the objects stopped appearing, and the dreams faded away. Eventually, I saved up enough money to move to a new place, and I haven't looked back since. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that shadow in the hallway and wonder if it's really gone or if it's just waiting for someone new to find it. When I was in my late 20s, I landed a job at a remote mountain lodge. It was one of those picturesque places people go to escape the chaos of the world. The lodge was surrounded by towering pines, and during the winter, the snow turned the entire area into a postcard-perfect scene. The catch: it was nearly 2 hours away from the nearest town. I had always been fine with solitude, so the isolation didn't bother me much. My job required me to oversee maintenance and occasionally help with guests, but most of the time I had the place to myself. It was peaceful until it wasn't. It started during my second week at the lodge. I was walking back to my cabin after locking up the main building for the night. It was freezing, and my boots crunched against the snow as I hurried along the path. About halfway to my cabin, I felt a sensation that's hard to describe. It was like someone was standing behind me, watching, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to shake it off, blaming the feeling on exhaustion, but that uneasiness didn't go away. Over the next few nights, I started noticing other things. The cabin would creak in ways it hadn't before, and shadows seemed darker and heavier than they should have been. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking. It wasn't the polite kind of knock you'd expect at the door. It was frantic, almost desperate. I stumbled out of bed and went to the door, half expecting to find one of the guests needing help. When I opened it, there was no one there, just the biting cold and the sound of the wind. Confused, I stepped outside and looked around, but the snow was untouched. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The knocking happened again the following night, and this time I stayed in bed, frozen with fear. I tried convincing myself it was an animal, though deep down I knew that wasn't it. The next morning, I mentioned the strange occurrences to one of the lodge's older employees, Frank. He gave me a long, measured look before saying, "You're not the first one to notice things around here." Frank explained that the lodge had a history. Decades ago, a man named Gerald had worked there as a groundskeeper. Gerald was quiet and kept to himself, but everyone who knew him said he was deeply protective of the lodge and the people who stayed there. One winter, a group of guests had gotten lost in the woods during a snowstorm. Gerald had gone out to find them and never returned. When the storm cleared, search teams found the guests, but Gerald's body was discovered miles away, frozen in the snow. Some of the staff believed that Gerald's spirit never left the lodge. Frank said most of the time, Gerald's presence was harmless doors shutting on their own, tools being moved around, but every once in a while, things would take a darker turn. I wasn't sure how to process what Frank had told me. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part couldn't ignore the knot of fear growing in my chest. A week later, I was working late in the maintenance shed organizing tools. The shed was small and crammed with equipment, so I had to keep the door open to let in some light from the floodlights outside. As I reached for a wrench on the highest shelf, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, there was a shadow. It wasn't like any shadow I'd seen before at a depth, almost like it was a person standing there, even though there was nothing to cast it. It was hovering just outside the doorway, perfectly still. I froze, heart pounding, but when I turned to look directly at it, the shadow was gone. I wanted to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but then the tools behind me clattered to the floor. I whipped around, expecting to find someone there, but the shed was empty. My hands shook as I picked up the tools and hurried back to my cabin, leaving the shed door wide open. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen and wondering if Frank's story about Gerald was true. The next incident was more direct. I was on a ladder in the main lodge fixing a light fixture. Suddenly the ladder shifted beneath me. It wasn't the kind of wobble you'd expect from an old ladder. It felt deliberate, like someone had pushed it. I barely managed to grab the edge of the fixture to keep from falling. When I climbed down, I noticed something on the floor beneath the ladder. It was a boot print, but it wasn't mine. It was smaller, almost like it belonged to someone wearing old, worn boots, the kind you'd expect from decades ago. I decided to take a break and head into town to clear my head. While there, I stopped by the local library and looked up anything I could find about Gerald. Most of the records were sparse, but one article caught my attention. It described the search for Gerald and the guests he had been trying to save. According to the article, one of the guests had mentioned seeing a shadowy figure following them through the storm. They thought it was Gerald, but when they turned to call out to him, the figure vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that Gerald, or whatever was left of him, was still tied to the lodge, watching over it in his own way. When I got back, things seemed to calm down for a few days. I almost convinced myself that whatever was happening had passed. But then, one evening, I was walking through the woods near the lodge when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't the soft, crunching sounds of animals. They were heavy, deliberate, like someone walking in boots. I stopped and turned, but the path was empty. The footsteps stopped too, but I could feel someone or something standing just beyond the line of trees, watching me. That's when I felt it. A cold, sharp tug on my jacket, as if someone was pulling me back toward the lodge. The air around me grew heavier, and I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, like I needed to leave the woods immediately. I didn't argue. I turned and ran back to the lodge as fast as I could. Later that night, a massive snowstorm rolled in. It was so bad that it knocked out power to the entire area, and the roads became completely impassable. If I hadn't turned back when I did, I might have gotten caught and lost my way. After that, I began to see Gerald's presence differently. I still felt uneasy at times, but I no longer believed he meant me harm. If anything, it felt like he was trying to protect me. I stayed at the lodge for another year before moving on to a new job. I never had another experience as intense as the one in the woods, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow or feel that strange tugging sensation, as if Gerald was still keeping watch. Even now, when I think back on my time at the lodge, I can't explain everything that happened. But I'm convinced that Gerald's spirit is still there, guarding the place he gave his life to protect. There was something.